The woman who rented my guest house was supposed to stay for 30 days. 30 quiet, uneventful days. That's what I told myself when the reservation request appeared in my inbox. I had no way of knowing that 30 days would turn into forever. My name is Ethan Parker. I live in a small coastal town called Willow Creek, Oregon, with my 9-year-old daughter, Sophie. Behind our house sits a renovated guest house overlooking the harbor. Most of the year it stays empty. Occasionally, tourists rent it for a few days. Sometimes writers come looking for peace and ocean views. None of them ever become part of our lives. That was the rule. Then Victoria night arrived. It started on a rainy Tuesday morning. I was repairing a fishing boat engine when Sophie burst into my workshop carrying a tablet. That alone should have worried me. Whenever my daughter carried technology, trouble usually followed. "Dad," she announced dramatically, "we have a new guest." I wiped grease from my hands. That's generally how renting works. Sophie ignored me. "She's staying a whole month. That's nice. And she's from New York." I nodded. "Also nice." Sophie narrowed her eyes. "You are not taking this seriously." "Should I be?" "Obviously." She shoved the tablet into my hands. The reservation details filled the screen. 1 month. Paid in full. No special requests. No visitors. No housekeeping. No interactions. "See?" Sophie said. "That's suspicious." "What's suspicious?" "Nobody wants 0 interactions." I stared at her. Most people do. Sad people do. My daughter had developed an alarming habit of psychoanalyzing strangers. Unfortunately, she was occasionally right. 3 days later, a black SUV rolled into our driveway just after noon. Sophie was already waiting by the window. Of course she was. She'd been monitoring the driveway like airport security all morning. "She's here." I looked outside. The vehicle parked near the guest house. A driver stepped out first. Then the rear passenger door opened. The woman who emerged didn't look like someone planning a vacation. She looked exhausted. Not physically exhausted, emotionally exhausted. Dark sunglasses hid most of her face. Her shoulders were tense. Her phone was already pressed against her ear before both feet touched the ground. Sophie immediately gasped. "She's pretty. You're 9. I have eyes." I chose not to continue that conversation. Outside, the woman ended her call, thanked the driver, and looked toward the ocean. For the first time, some of the tension left her face. Just a little, like she'd finally reached a place where nobody expected anything from her. Then she noticed us watching from the kitchen window. Sophie waved enthusiastically. The woman froze. For a moment, she looked completely unprepared for human interaction. Then she offered a small, polite wave back. "See?" Sophie announced. "She needs friends. She needs unpacking time. Friends first." Before I could stop her, my daughter was already heading toward the front door. "Sophie." Too late. "Sophie." The door slammed shut behind her. I sighed heavily and followed. By the time I caught up, she had already crossed half the yard. The woman was unloading a suitcase when Sophie arrived beside her. "Hi." The woman blinked. "Hi, I'm Sophie. Nice to meet you, Sophie. You rented our guest house." "I did. Are you lonely?" "I nearly died. Right there in the driveway." The woman looked stunned, completely stunned. "What?" Sophie smiled brightly. "You seem lonely." Silence followed. The ocean waves crashed gently behind us. Somewhere a seagull screamed. Finally I reached them. "Please ignore my daughter." The woman laughed unexpectedly. A real laugh. Short but genuine. "It's okay." Sophie pointed at her. "See?" "See what?" "You laughed." Apparently that proved something. The woman looked between us and shook her head. "I'm Victoria." We shook hands. Up close, she looked familiar. Very familiar. It took several seconds before my brain finally caught up. Then my stomach dropped. Victoria Knight, CEO of Knight Global. One of the most recognizable business leaders in the country. Apparently my guest house had just been rented by a billionaire. Sophie had no idea. "Do you like pancakes?" she asked. Victoria blinked. "I'm sorry? Pancakes." My daughter nodded seriously. "It's an important question." Victoria laughed again. "Yes. Good." Sophie smiled. "You're coming to breakfast tomorrow." Sophie, what? She just got here. Victoria surprised me by smiling. Actually, She looked toward the guest house, then back at Sophie. Breakfast sounds nice. My daughter looked unbearably pleased with herself. As Victoria carried her suitcase toward the guest house, Sophie leaned closer to me. See? See what? Told you. You told me a lot of things. She watched Victoria disappear through the front door. Then she smiled in a way that immediately made me nervous. She's staying longer than a month. I stared at her. You have absolutely no way of knowing that. Sophie looked toward the guest house again. We'll see. And standing there in the driveway while a billionaire CEO unpacked her life 50 feet from my back porch, I had a feeling my daughter was about to make all of our lives significantly more complicated. The problem was that Sophie didn't see complications. She saw opportunities. Specifically, opportunities to make friends with people who clearly wanted to be left alone. The next morning, I woke up to find my daughter already dressed and standing in the kitchen holding a plate of pancakes. No, you don't even know what I'm doing. I absolutely do. Sophie smiled. Then why are you fighting it? Because I was her father, and experience had taught me that every sentence beginning with, "I'm just being friendly," eventually became a story people told for years. Outside, the guest house remained quiet. The curtains were closed. The harbor beyond it glowed beneath the early morning sunlight. Everything looked peaceful. Unfortunately, Sophie was carrying pancakes. Peace was no longer an option. She said yes. She was being polite. She smiled. People smile when they're trapped. Sophie ignored me completely and headed outside. I followed because someone had to minimize the damage. We reached the guest house just as the front door opened. Victoria stepped outside holding a coffee mug. For a moment she looked surprised to find us standing there. Then she noticed the plate. Oh no. Sophie laughed. Why does everyone say that? Victoria glanced at me. Because we're adults. That earned the third genuine laugh I'd heard from her. More than she had probably laughed during the previous month combined. Sophie proudly handed over the pancakes. Breakfast delivery. Victoria stared at them. Then at Sophie. Then back at the pancakes. Nobody has ever delivered pancakes to me before. That's sad. Probably. Another laugh escaped her. Then she surprised all of us by taking a bite. Sophie immediately looked victorious. Well? Victoria considered it carefully. These are excellent. Dad made them. Victoria turned toward me. You make good pancakes. Apparently that's my greatest achievement. Sophie nodded. It's definitely top 5. The conversation continued longer than I expected. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Victoria sat on the small porch, while Sophie asked approximately 400 questions. Where was she from? Did she like Oregon? Had she ever gone fishing? What was New York like? Did she have pets? Did she know any movie stars? Victoria answered most of them with remarkable patience. Occasionally she looked overwhelmed, but not in an unhappy way. More like someone who wasn't used to being treated like a normal person. Eventually her phone rang. The effect was immediate. The smile disappeared. Her shoulders tensed. The relaxed woman sitting on the porch vanished and the CEO returned. I have to take this. Sophie nodded. Work? Victoria sighed. Work. For a brief second, disappointment crossed Sophie's face. Then she smiled again. We'll be here later. Victoria looked strangely touched by that. I believe you. Back at the house, Sophie helped me clean up breakfast dishes while constantly glancing toward the guest house. She's lonely. I groaned. We're still doing this? Dad. She rolled her eyes dramatically. She's working on vacation. That was difficult to argue with. Throughout the day, Victoria barely left the guest house. Calls, meetings, video conferences, more calls. Around lunch, I noticed her sitting on the porch staring at the ocean with a laptop balanced on her knees. Even from a distance, she looked exhausted, not the kind of tired sleep could fix. The kind that settles deep inside someone after years of carrying too much responsibility. That evening, Willow Creek held its weekly harbor market. Every Thursday, local vendors lined the waterfront with food, crafts, music, and community events. The entire town showed up. Sophie considered attendance mandatory. We should invite her. No. Why? Because she's working. Sophie crossed her arms. Because she's hiding. Unfortunately, there was a difference. Around 6 o'clock, Sophie vanished. Again. By now I was developing a strong dislike for that word. When I finally found her, she was standing outside the guest house talking to Victoria. "You have exactly 10 seconds to explain this," Sophie pointed triumphantly. She said yes. Victoria covered her face while laughing. In my defense, she didn't really ask. "What happened?" I asked. Victoria lowered her hand. She informed me that Harbor Market was happening, and then she informed me that staying inside would be a terrible life choice. I closed my eyes. That sounds like her. 10 minutes later, the three of us were walking toward the harbor. The market was already crowded. Music floated through the air. Food trucks lined the waterfront. Children ran between booths. The smell of fresh seafood and baked goods filled the evening breeze. Victoria stopped walking. "Wow," Sophie smiled proudly. "Told you." For the next 2 hours, something remarkable happened. Victoria relaxed. Not completely, but enough. She browsed local shops, talked with vendors, sampled food, listened to music. At one point, she found herself sitting beside an elderly woman who spent 15 minutes explaining the history of Willow Creek. Instead of escaping, Victoria listened. Actually listened. Then she bought homemade jam she definitely didn't need. Later, while watching the sunset over the harbor, she looked genuinely happy. The sight caught me off guard, because it wasn't the polished smile she used for cameras. It wasn't the professional smile she used in interviews. It was real. Then Sophie quietly appeared beside me. "See?" I looked down. "What now?" She pointed toward Victoria watching the sunset. "She's already starting to feel better." For once, I didn't argue, because looking at Victoria standing there beneath the golden evening light, I had a feeling my daughter might be right. The scary part was that Victoria seemed to be realizing it too. Friday morning arrived with clear skies, calm water, and a level of enthusiasm from Sophie that should have required government regulation. I knew trouble was coming the moment I walked into the kitchen and found her drawing something on a large piece of poster board. "What are you doing?" Sophie immediately covered it. "Nothing. That's never true," she sighed dramatically. "Fine. It's a welcome package." My stomach tightened. "For who?" She stared at me like I'd asked whether water was wet. "Victoria." Of course it was. Over the last 24 hours, my daughter had apparently decided that the woman renting our guest house needed to be fully integrated into Willow Creek society, whether she wanted to be or not. An hour later, Sophie marched across the yard carrying a gift basket containing homemade cookies, a town map, 3 handwritten restaurant recommendations, a list of local events, and something she called a friendship emergency contact sheet. I didn't ask. Some mysteries are safer unsolved. Victoria answered the door wearing jeans and a loose sweater, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. For the first time since arriving, she didn't look like a corporate executive hiding from the world. She looked like a normal woman enjoying a quiet morning. Sophie handed her the basket. "Welcome." Victoria blinked. "Again? This one is official. There was an unofficial version? Yesterday." Victoria laughed and accepted the basket. Then she pulled out the friendship emergency contact sheet. Her eyebrows immediately rose. "What exactly is this?" Sophie pointed proudly. "If you're sad, bored, lonely, hungry, confused, lost, stressed, or need pancakes, call us." I nearly choked. Victoria stared at the paper for several seconds before laughing so hard she had to lean against the doorframe. It was easily the longest laugh I'd heard from her yet. The sound surprised even her. For a moment she simply stood there smiling. Then something changed. The smile softened, became more genuine, more vulnerable. "Thank you, Sophie." My daughter nodded seriously. "Everyone needs emergency contacts." The scary thing was that she actually believed it. That afternoon, Victoria wandered into my workshop. Not because Sophie dragged her there. Not because someone invited her. She simply showed up. I was rebuilding a vintage boat engine when she appeared in the doorway. "Can I watch?" The question caught me off guard. "It's not very exciting." She looked around the workshop. Wooden boats, tools, half-finished restoration projects, sunlight pouring through dusty windows. "Compared to my normal meetings?" She smiled. Trust me, this is fascinating. So she stayed. At first, she just watched. Then she asked questions. Good questions. Intelligent questions. Questions that made it obvious she genuinely wanted to understand how everything worked. Eventually, she sat on a stool beside the workbench while I explained the restoration process. 2 hours disappeared without either of us noticing. At one point, Victoria looked at the nearly restored boat and smiled. You know what's strange? What? When I was younger, I wanted to build things. That surprised me. Really? She nodded. Not boats. A small laugh escaped her. But things that mattered. Another pause. Somewhere along the way, I stopped creating and started managing. The answer lingered between us. Then she looked around the workshop again. This place feels different. Different how? Victoria thought carefully. Nobody's trying to impress anyone. I smiled. That's because boats don't care about your resume. That earned another laugh, a real one. More and more, those seemed to arrive naturally. Later that evening, Sophie organized what she called family movie night. The fact that nobody had agreed to this detail apparently didn't matter. By 7 o'clock she had blankets arranged across the living room, bowls of popcorn prepared, and enough snacks to survive a natural disaster. We're watching a movie. Victoria looked amused. Is this optional? No. Thought so. 30 minutes later, the three of us sat together watching an old family comedy while rain tapped gently against the windows. Halfway through the movie, I noticed something unusual. Victoria wasn't checking her phone. Not once. The device sat untouched on the coffee table. No emails, no meetings, no conference calls, just a woman laughing at a movie while sharing popcorn with a stubborn child and a boat mechanic. Somewhere around the middle of the film, Sophie quietly fell asleep against Victoria's shoulder. Neither of them noticed at first. Then Victoria looked down. Her expression changed instantly. Softer, warmer, more emotional than she'd probably intended. Very carefully, she adjusted the blanket over Sophie without waking her. The gesture was small, simple, yet something about it hit me unexpectedly hard. Because for the first time since she'd arrived, Victoria didn't look like a guest. She looked like she belonged there. The realization unsettled me more than it should have. When the movie ended, I carried Sophie upstairs. By the time I returned, Victoria was standing alone on the back porch overlooking the harbor. The rain had stopped. Moonlight reflected across the water. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Victoria smiled softly. I forgot what this feels like. What? She looked toward the house. Toward the room where Sophie was sleeping. Toward the life unfolding around her. Being around people who aren't asking me for something. The honesty in her voice caught me completely off guard. Then she laughed quietly. Actually, that's not true. I raised an eyebrow. No? Your daughter asks me for things constantly. I couldn't argue with that. Victoria smiled again, but somehow it feels different. The harbor remained quiet around us. Then she looked back toward the guest house. Her temporary home. The place she'd rented for 1 month. The place that already felt less temporary than either of us wanted to admit. And as the ocean breeze drifted across the porch, I realized something important. Victoria Knight had come to Willow Creek, looking for peace. What she was finding instead might be something far more dangerous. She was finding reasons to stay. Victoria Knight was finding reasons to stay. The problem was that Willow Creek had a way of turning reasons into attachments before people realized what was happening. Saturday morning began with Sophie standing beside my bed at 6:30 in the morning. That alone was a bad sign. Nobody standing beside your bed before sunrise ever brings good news. Dad, I groaned. No. You don't know what I'm going to say. I don't need to. Victoria is coming to the Harbor Festival. I opened one eye. That's not an emergency. It absolutely is. Then she smiled. The smile of someone about to create problems. She's excited. That got my attention, because Sophie wasn't wrong. Over the last few days, Victoria had changed. The tension that followed her everywhere was fading. She smiled more, laughed more, left her phone unanswered for entire stretches of time. Sometimes I caught her sitting on the guest house porch simply watching the ocean, not working, not planning, just existing. Around 10 o'clock, we met her downtown. The Harbor Festival was Willow Creek's biggest summer event. Local bands, food stalls, craft vendors, boat races. Hundreds of people packed the waterfront. Victoria arrived wearing jeans, white sneakers, and a light blue sweater. No designer suit, no executive attitude, just Victoria. Sophie immediately grabbed her hand. "You're with us," Victoria laughed. "Do I have a choice?" "No, thought so." Within 20 minutes, Victoria had been introduced to half the town. Again. Somehow every conversation ended with someone inviting her somewhere. Lunch, charity committees, community projects, book clubs, volunteer programs. At one point she looked at me in disbelief. "Does everyone here recruit people?" "Pretty much. This feels aggressive. Wait until the bake sale committee finds you." Her eyes widened. "The what?" I chose not to answer. Some dangers are impossible to explain. Around noon, the annual harbor boat race began. Dozens of people gathered near the docks to watch. Sophie climbed onto a railing for a better view despite repeated instructions not to. Victoria immediately noticed. "Is she allowed to do that?" "No." "Shouldn't you stop her?" "Probably." Victoria looked horrified. "You're very relaxed about parenting." "I'm tired." That made her laugh harder than it should have. The race ended with cheering crowds and exactly one boat accidentally drifting into a fishing pier. Nobody seemed particularly surprised. Apparently this happened every year. Afterward, we wandered through the festival eating food that was probably unhealthy and definitely delicious. At one point, Sophie disappeared. My heart stopped for approximately 3 seconds. Then we found her helping an elderly vendor organize handmade bracelets. "You can't keep doing that," I told her. "Doing what?" "Vanishing." Sophie looked confused. "I was helping." Victoria smiled. "To be fair, that's exactly where I expected her to be." The scary thing was that she was right. By late afternoon, the festival reached its busiest point. Music echoed across the harbor. Children ran through the streets. Families crowded every corner. Victoria stood beside me watching the scene unfold. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then she smiled softly. "I think I understand why people stay here." I glanced at her. "Only now? I'm from Manhattan." She laughed. "This is a very different universe." Then her expression shifted. More thoughtful, more vulnerable. "You know what's strange?" "What?" She looked towards Sophie laughing with a group of children near the water. For the first time in years, a pause followed. "I don't feel like I'm missing something." The honesty hit harder than expected. Before I could respond, Sophie came running back toward us carrying 3 ice cream cones. "Emergency." Victoria blinked. "Emergency. Ice cream emergency." My daughter handed one to each of us. You both looked emotional. I stared at her. "That's not a thing." "It is now." Victoria laughed so hard she nearly dropped her cone. For several minutes, all 3 of us sat on a bench overlooking the harbor while the festival continued around us. It was simple, ordinary, completely unremarkable, yet somehow it felt important. Then the moment happened. Small enough that most people would have missed it. Sophie leaned against Victoria's shoulder without thinking. Victoria instinctively wrapped an arm around her. Neither of them seemed to notice. I did. And judging by the expression on Victoria's face a few seconds later, eventually she did too. The realization surprised her. Not because she disliked it, because she liked it far more than she should have. As the sun slowly began setting over the harbor, painting the water gold, I found myself looking at the 2 of them together. One lonely CEO, one unstoppable little girl. Somehow they'd known each other less than a week. Yet it already felt like they'd been part of each other's lives much longer. And standing there beneath the fading sunlight while laughter drifted across the harbor, I began to suspect something neither of them had fully realized yet. Victoria Knight wasn't just becoming attached to Willow Creek. She was becoming attached to us. Victoria Knight was becoming attached to us. The scary part was that I wasn't sure any of us knew what to do about it. Sunday morning arrived with sunshine pouring through the windows and Sophie already planning everyone's day before breakfast. Some things never changed. "Today is important," she announced while carrying a stack of papers into the kitchen. My stomach tightened immediately. Why? Because Victoria has officially been here 1 week. Victoria looked up from her coffee. That's important? Obviously. Sophie placed the papers on the table. We're celebrating. Victoria laughed. People celebrate surviving me? We're celebrating you surviving us. That earned a genuine smile. One of the things I'd begun noticing was how much easier smiling seemed for her now. The guarded expressions were appearing less often. The tiredness behind her eyes wasn't disappearing completely, but it was fading, little by little. Breakfast lasted almost an hour, because Sophie kept inventing new rules for the celebration. By the end, Victoria had somehow agreed to participate in what my daughter called a Willow Creek orientation challenge. I have concerns, Victoria admitted. That's normal. You sound proud of that. I am. By 10 o'clock, the challenge was underway. Stop 1 involved identifying local landmarks. Stop 2 involved sampling food from various vendors. Stop 3 required learning the names of several harbor workers. Victoria approached every task with surprising enthusiasm, mostly because Sophie treated the competition like an Olympic event. The entire town seemed delighted to participate. Shop owners offered clues. Neighbors gave hints. Several people openly cheated in Victoria's favor. At one point she laughed and shook her head. This challenge is rigged. Correct, Sophie said proudly. For who? You. The scary thing was that nobody denied it. By afternoon, the challenge ended near the waterfront. Victoria technically won, mostly because everyone decided she should. Sophie presented her with a handmade certificate declaring her an honorary resident of Willow Creek. Victoria accepted it with more seriousness than the situation deserved. Then she surprised everyone by framing it as soon as she returned to the guest house. Sophie nearly cried from happiness. The rest of us pretended that was normal. Later that evening, I was closing the workshop when I noticed someone sitting alone on the dock. Victoria. The harbor was quiet. Most of the town had gone home. The water reflected the last traces of sunset. For a moment I considered leaving her alone. Then she noticed me and smiled. You can sit down if you want. So I did. Neither of us spoke immediately. The silence felt comfortable now. Familiar. Then Victoria looked out at the ocean. Do you ever wonder how your life would have turned out somewhere else? The question caught me off guard. Sometimes. She nodded. I used to think success would answer every question. Another pause. Turns out it just creates different ones. The honesty didn't surprise me anymore. Not from her. More and more, she seemed tired of pretending everything was fine. Do you regret it? I asked. Victoria thought carefully. The company? She shook her head. No. Another pause. But I regret how much of my life I missed while building it. The words lingered between us. Then she laughed softly. This is probably a terrible conversation for a Sunday evening. I've heard worse. Really? My daughter once explained cryptocurrency to me. Victoria laughed so hard she had to look away. The sound echoed across the harbor, and for a moment she looked genuinely happy. Then her phone rang. Everything changed instantly. The smile faded. Her shoulders tightened. The peaceful woman sitting beside me disappeared, and the CEO returned. Victoria stared at the screen for several seconds. You don't have to answer, she sighed. Unfortunately, I do. The call lasted 15 minutes. 15 increasingly unpleasant minutes. Even from a distance, I could tell it wasn't good. When she finally ended the call, she looked exhausted again. Not physically, emotionally. Bad news? I asked. Victoria stared out at the water. The board wants me back in New York. My stomach tightened. There it was. The thing we'd all been quietly avoiding. Reality. Another pause followed. They're worried. About what? Victoria laughed bitterly. Apparently spending time being happy is concerning. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then she looked toward the guest house. Toward the town beyond it. Toward the life she'd begun building here. I knew this was coming. What are you going to do? The question lingered between us. Victoria didn't answer immediately, because she didn't know. Maybe for the first time in her life, she genuinely didn't know. And watching her stare across the dark water while the lights of Willow Creek reflected behind her, I realized something unsettling. This wasn't just about a job anymore. It wasn't about New York or Oregon. It wasn't even about the company. Because somewhere during the last week, Victoria Knight had stopped deciding where she wanted to live. She had started deciding where she belonged, and those two things were no longer the same. Where she wanted to live and where she belonged were no longer the same thing. Monday morning arrived with a heavy fog rolling across the harbor. Normally I liked mornings like that. Quiet, peaceful, predictable. Unfortunately, predictability had left my life the moment Victoria rented the guest house. I found Sophie sitting at the kitchen table staring thoughtfully out the window. That was unusual. My daughter rarely sat quietly unless she was planning something. "What's wrong?" I asked. She looked toward the guest house. "Victoria is sad." I sighed. "You know that's not actually a superpower, right?" Sophie rolled her eyes. "Dad." The scary part was that she was usually right. An hour later I saw Victoria walking slowly along the harbor, phone in hand, shoulders tense, deep in thought, the same expression she'd worn after the board meeting call. By lunchtime she had barely spoken. By afternoon she had canceled plans with several local volunteers. By evening she looked exhausted again, not because Willow Creek was tiring her out, because New York was pulling on her from 2,000 miles away. Tuesday wasn't much better. The calls continued. Video meetings, investor concerns, board pressure, endless discussions about leadership, responsibility, and expectations. Sophie finally reached her limit during dinner. "I don't like New York." Victoria nearly laughed into her drink. "You've never been there." "I don't need to." My daughter crossed her arms. "They're making you unhappy." Victoria looked down at her plate. The silence lasted long enough to become uncomfortable. Then she smiled sadly. "It's a little more complicated than that." Sophie shook her head. "Adults always say that when they know the answer already." Neither Victoria nor I responded. Mostly because we suspected she might be right. The following afternoon, Sophie arrived home from school carrying a giant poster board. My pulse immediately accelerated. Historically, poster boards never led anywhere good. "What is that?" I asked. "A project. Dangerous words. Helpful words." Which was somehow worse. Before I could investigate further, she disappeared into her room. 2 hours later she emerged carrying the finished poster. Across the top were the words, "Why Victoria Should Stay in Willow Creek." My soul left my body immediately. There were photographs, drawings, charts, testimonials from neighbors, a pie chart labeled, "Happiness." Somehow Mrs. Henderson had contributed comments. So had the bakery owner. Half the town appeared involved. "Absolutely not." Sophie looked offended. "It's evidence. It's emotional blackmail. It's community feedback." Victoria walked into the kitchen at exactly the wrong moment. She stopped, stared at the poster, then looked at Sophie, then back at the poster. For several seconds nobody spoke. Finally Victoria laughed so hard she had to sit down. Actual tears formed in her eyes. "What is this?" Sophie proudly pointed at the first section. "Reasons." Another section. "More reasons." Then the pie chart. "Scientific proof." Victoria completely lost the ability to remain serious. Watching her laugh like that felt strangely important, because she'd spent most of the week carrying the weight of New York on her shoulders. For a few minutes, it disappeared. Later that evening, after Sophie went upstairs, Victoria and I sat on the porch overlooking the ocean. The fog had cleared. The harbor lights reflected across the water. Everything felt quiet again. Eventually, Victoria broke the silence. "The board wants me back next month." My stomach tightened. "For how long?" She sighed. "They're hoping permanently." There it was, the thing we'd both been avoiding. Another pause followed. "And what do you want?" Victoria didn't answer immediately. Instead she looked toward the guest house, then toward our house, then toward the harbor. The life she'd built here, the people who cared about her, the place that had slowly become home. "I don't know," she whispered. The answer sounded honest, painfully honest, because for the first time in her life, there wasn't a spreadsheet or business model that could solve the problem. This wasn't about money, or growth, or strategy. It was about choosing a life, and those decisions were harder, much harder. Then she smiled softly. "You know what's funny?" "What?" 6 weeks ago I would have left without thinking twice. Another pause. "Now the idea of leaving makes me miserable." The words settled between us. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then Victoria looked out toward the ocean again. That probably says something. I nodded slowly. Yeah. What? I smiled. I think Willow Creek got you. That earned a laugh. A quiet one. Then she shook her head. No. Her smile softened. Warmer. More vulnerable. More honest. I think the people did. For a moment, neither of us looked away. The harbor lights shimmered across the water. The ocean breeze drifted through the darkness. And for the first time, I realized the real problem wasn't whether Victoria would stay. The real problem was that I wasn't sure I wanted her to leave either. The real problem was that I wasn't sure I wanted Victoria to leave either. That realization followed me for the rest of the week. It followed me through boat repairs, grocery runs, harbor meetings, and every moment I accidentally caught myself looking toward the guest house to see if her lights were on. The situation wasn't helping. Victoria was becoming part of our lives so naturally that none of us seemed to notice it happening anymore. She joined us for dinner more often than not. She knew Sophie's school schedule better than I did. She had opinions about local restaurants, favorite walking routes along the harbor, and an ongoing disagreement with Mrs. Henderson about the proper way to organize a charity fundraiser. Somehow the billionaire CEO from Manhattan had become a normal resident of Willow Creek. The scary part was how right it felt. Then Friday arrived and everything became more complicated. I was working in the marina when a sleek black sedan rolled into the parking lot. Immediately I knew it didn't belong. Willow Creek vehicles tended to be practical. Trucks, SUVs, family cars. This thing looked like it belonged outside a skyscraper. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, mid-50s. Silver hair. The expression of someone who had never repaired anything in his life. He looked around the marina as if the ocean personally offended him. Then he walked directly toward me. Ethan Parker? I nodded. Depends who's asking. The man didn't smile. Richard Calloway. My stomach tightened. I knew the name. Board member. Knight Global. One of the people helping run Victoria's empire. Richard glanced around the workshop. The tools. The boats. The smell of engine oil and salt water. His expression made it clear he considered all of it beneath him. I'd like a word. Sounds ominous. It probably is. That wasn't encouraging. We stepped outside. Richard immediately got to the point. Victoria is making a mistake. I folded my arms. That's her decision. Not when 30,000 employees are depending on her. There it was, the corporate argument. Responsibility, duty, obligation. I had expected it. Richard sighed impatiently. She built one of the most successful companies in America. I know. Then why are you encouraging this? I stared at him. Encouraging what? This fantasy. The word irritated me immediately. Richard gestured toward the harbor. This town. Another gesture. This lifestyle. Another. You. For a moment I simply looked at him. Then I laughed. Not because anything was funny, because the situation was ridiculous. You think I'm the reason she's happy? Richard didn't answer. Which was answer enough. Interesting. He frowned. What's interesting? You people keep talking about happiness like it's a problem. The silence that followed stretched longer than he expected. Eventually Richard shook his head. You don't understand the pressure she's under. Maybe. I nodded. But I understand what she looks like when she smiles. That ended the conversation. Richard left shortly afterward. He didn't look happy. Neither did I. Because despite his arrogance, one thing bothered me. He was right about one thing. Victoria was facing a choice. And eventually she would have to make it. That evening she arrived at our house carrying takeout containers and an expression that told me she already knew Richard had visited. How bad was it? She asked. On a scale from 1 to 10? Sure. Corporate. Victoria groaned and dropped into a chair. That's worse than 10. Sophie looked between us. Who's Richard? Victoria sighed. A man who believes work should be everyone's entire personality. Sophie immediately frowned. That sounds awful. Victoria pointed. Exactly. Dinner helped. Dinner always helped. By the end of the meal, Sophie had shifted the conversation toward school projects, local gossip, and whether seagulls secretly held meetings when humans weren't watching. Somehow that topic lasted 20 minutes. Victoria laughed more that evening than she had all week, yet I still noticed something. Every now and then she'd go quiet, thoughtful, distant, as if part of her mind was still sitting in a boardroom thousands of miles away. Later that night, after Sophie went upstairs, Victoria and I sat on the porch overlooking the harbor. The water reflected hundreds of lights from boats anchored offshore. The air smelled like salt and cedar. Neither of us spoke for a while. Eventually, Victoria broke the silence. "Do you think people can outgrow their old lives?" The question caught me off guard. "Sometimes," she nodded slowly. "I keep waiting for someone to tell me what the right answer is." "And?" Victoria laughed softly. "Apparently nobody knows." Another pause followed. Then she looked toward the guest house, the place she'd rented for 1 month. The place she'd now occupied for nearly 2. "I don't want to go back." The words were barely above a whisper. Honest, vulnerable, real. I looked at her, really looked at her. The woman who had arrived exhausted, isolated, and emotionally burned out. The woman who now spent weekends at community festivals and knew half the town by name. "Then don't." The answer came out before I could stop it. Victoria turned toward me. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she smiled. Small. Emotional. Dangerous. "You make that sound easy." "Maybe it is." Her eyes held mine longer than usual. Long enough to make my pulse forget how to behave. Long enough to make me wonder if she felt it too. Then a voice shattered the moment. I knew it. We both jumped. Sophie stood at the screen door holding a glass of water. Victoria covered her face immediately. "How long have you been there?" "Long enough." My daughter looked entirely too pleased with herself. "You two should really hurry up." Victoria laughed so hard she nearly fell out of her chair. I groaned. Sophie nodded confidently. "Don't worry, I have a plan." And standing there beneath the harbor lights while my daughter smiled like a tiny criminal mastermind, I suddenly had a feeling that whatever Sophie Parker was planning next was going to change everything. I suddenly had a feeling that whatever Sophie Parker was planning next was going to change everything. The problem with Sophie was that she viewed obstacles as puzzles and adults. Unfortunately, her definition of obvious and everyone else's definition rarely matched. The following Saturday morning, I discovered just how serious she was. I walked into the kitchen and found construction paper, markers, glue sticks, photographs, and enough craft supplies to qualify as a small art store spread across the table. Sophie looked up. "Good morning." I immediately became suspicious. "No. You don't even know what I'm doing." "I know you're doing something." Victoria entered a few seconds later carrying coffee from the guest house. She stopped, looked at the table, then looked at Sophie. "Should we be worried?" "Probably," I answered. Sophie rolled her eyes dramatically. "Nobody appreciates vision." That was never a comforting sentence. Around noon, Willow Creek hosted its annual summer community fair. The entire waterfront transformed into a festival of food, music, games, and local vendors. Families filled the streets. Children ran everywhere. The harbor sparkled beneath perfect blue skies. It should have been a relaxing day. It wasn't. Mostly because Sophie spent the entire morning acting suspiciously cheerful. By now, both Victoria and I recognized that as a warning sign. "What are you planning?" Victoria asked as we walked toward the festival. "Nothing. That's a lie. A small lie. Still a lie." Sophie smiled. "You'll see, those 3 words should honestly be banned." The fair was already crowded when we arrived. Music echoed across the waterfront. Local bands performed on outdoor stages. Food trucks lined the streets. Every few minutes someone stopped Victoria to say hello. The change was remarkable. When she'd first arrived, people recognized her as a famous CEO. Now they greeted her as Victoria, just Victoria. A friend, a neighbor, someone who belonged. I noticed it. She noticed it too. Every time another person waved, her smile became a little more genuine. Around mid-afternoon, the mayor stepped onto the main stage. "Attention, everyone." The crowd slowly gathered. Families moved closer. Children climbed onto shoulders. Victoria and I exchanged a look. We both knew immediately that Sophie was involved somehow. The mayor cleared his throat. Today we'd like to recognize someone who has become an important part of our community. My stomach dropped. Victoria's eyes widened. No. Sophie grinned. Yes. The mayor continued. Someone who arrived as a visitor and became a friend. The crowd began smiling. Someone who has supported local schools, community projects, charities, and approximately 17 different bake sales. Laughter spread through the audience. Victoria covered her face. I'm going to move. Too late, Sophie whispered. Then the giant banner behind the stage unfurled. Across the front, in giant colorful letters, were the words, Official Willow Creek Appreciation Day for Victoria Knight. The entire crowd erupted into applause. Victoria looked absolutely horrified and completely touched, both at the same time. You made a holiday? She asked Sophie. Technically a celebration. That's worse. The mayor invited her onto the stage. She resisted for approximately 3 seconds before realizing escape was impossible. As Victoria climbed the steps, applause continued across the harbor. Hundreds of people cheering. Not because she was rich, not because she was successful, because they genuinely liked her, because she mattered to them. Standing there beneath the summer sunlight, Victoria looked out across the crowd, the town, the harbor, the people who had somehow become part of her life. Then her eyes found Sophie, then me. Something shifted in her expression, something emotional, something real. When I came here, she said into the microphone, I planned to stay 30 days. The crowd laughed. Victoria smiled. Honestly, I didn't even want to leave the guest house. More laughter followed. Then her voice softened. But this town, she paused, looking around at the people gathered before her. This town reminded me of something I'd forgotten. Silence settled across the harbor. That success means very little if you have nobody to share it with. The words hit harder than anyone expected, even her. For a moment, the entire crowd remained quiet. Then applause thundered across the waterfront again. Victoria stepped away from the microphone looking emotional, very emotional. Sophie immediately ran onto the stage and hugged her. The crowd loved that even more. By evening, the fair continued, but something felt different. The celebration had become more than a joke, more than a town event. It had become a declaration. Willow Creek had chosen Victoria. And judging by the look on her face every time she glanced around the harbor, Victoria had chosen Willow Creek too. Later that night, after the fair ended, Victoria sat beside me on the dock watching moonlight dance across the water. For several minutes neither of us spoke. Then she smiled softly. I've never had a day like that before. A public holiday? She laughed. Definitely not that. Another pause. People don't usually celebrate me. I looked at her. Maybe they should. The words slipped out before I could stop them. Victoria turned toward me. The silence that followed felt different. Longer, warmer, more dangerous. Neither of us looked away. Neither of us seemed interested in looking away. Then a firework suddenly exploded over the harbor. We both jumped. Somewhere behind us, Sophie yelled, "You're welcome." Victoria immediately started laughing. I did too. Because of course, she was responsible. Of course. Yet as the fireworks reflected across the water and laughter echoed through the harbor, one thing became impossible to ignore. This was no longer about a guest house rental, no longer about a vacation, no longer about escaping New York. Somewhere along the way, Victoria Knight had become part of our story. And for the first time, I was beginning to suspect she wanted that just as much as we did. For the first time, I was beginning to suspect Victoria wanted this just as much as we did. The problem was that life rarely allows people to keep something valuable without testing how much it matters to them. 3 days after the harbor fair, reality arrived in Willow Creek wearing expensive shoes. I was working in the marina when a black luxury SUV pulled into the parking lot. Immediately I knew it wasn't local. Nothing about it belonged here. The vehicle looked more comfortable outside a Manhattan skyscraper than beside fishing boats and crab traps. 2 people stepped out. One was Richard Calloway. The other was a woman I didn't recognize. Expensive suit, professional posture, the expression of someone carrying bad news. My stomach tightened before they even reached me. Richard didn't waste time. We need to speak with Victoria. I leaned against the workbench. Then you should probably call her. The woman stepped forward. We've been trying. That wasn't surprising. Victoria had become remarkably selective about answering certain calls, especially lately. Richard glanced around the harbor with the same disapproval he'd shown during his first visit. This has gone on long enough. I didn't respond. Mostly because I wasn't interested in helping him. A few minutes later they left, unfortunately, not before making it very clear they weren't in town for a friendly conversation. That evening, Victoria arrived at the house looking unusually tired. The moment she stepped through the door, Sophie knew something was wrong. Bad day? Victoria sighed. A little. Sophie immediately narrowed her eyes. New York? Victoria looked impressed. How do you do that? Easy. My daughter shrugged. You only make that face when New York calls. The scary part was how accurate that was. During dinner, Victoria finally explained everything. Richard wasn't acting alone. Several major investors had become concerned. Board members wanted her back. Analysts were questioning her commitment. Financial media had started speculating about leadership changes. Every day the pressure increased. Every day the calls became more aggressive. Sophie listened carefully. Then she asked the question nobody else had. Are they asking what you want? Victoria froze. Completely froze. The table became silent. Finally she laughed softly. Not really. Sophie nodded. That's rude. Nobody argued. Because somehow she'd managed to summarize the entire situation in 2 words. After dinner, Victoria and I sat on the porch while Sophie worked on homework inside. The harbor was quiet. The ocean moved gently beneath the moonlight. For several minutes neither of us spoke. Then Victoria finally broke the silence. They're coming tomorrow. I already knew who she meant. Richard. The investors. The people trying to pull her back into the life she'd left behind. What are you going to do? She looked out toward the water. I honestly don't know. The answer sounded heavier this time. More painful. Because the choice wasn't theoretical anymore. It was here. Waiting. Real. Another pause followed. Part of me feels guilty. Why? Victoria laughed bitterly. Because I built that company. Another pause. Thousands of people depend on it. I understood that. I really did. But I also understood something else. And what about you? She turned toward me. What about me? How long do you keep sacrificing your life for something that doesn't make you happy? The question landed harder than I intended. Victoria didn't answer immediately. Because she didn't have one. The next day, Willow Creek received an unusual number of luxury vehicles. 3 black SUVs arrived before noon, then another. By early afternoon, half the town knew something was happening. Small towns work that way. Information travels faster than the internet. Victoria agreed to meet everyone at a private conference room near the marina. She wanted neutral ground. Somewhere between New York and Willow Creek. Somewhere that felt fair. The meeting lasted nearly 4 hours, 4 very long hours. While it happened, Sophie and I waited at the harbor. Technically, we weren't waiting. According to Sophie, we were being available. There was apparently a difference. Around 5 o'clock, the conference room doors finally opened. Executives emerged first, then lawyers, then investors. Most of them looked frustrated. Some looked confused. Richard looked like a man who had just lost an argument he expected to win. Finally, Victoria appeared. The moment I saw her face, I knew something had changed. She looked calmer, lighter, more certain. Sophie noticed too. Before anyone could say a word, she sprinted across the parking lot. Well, Victoria laughed. Well, what? Are you staying? Direct, efficient, typical Sophie. For a moment, Victoria simply looked at her. Then she smiled. The biggest smile I'd seen in weeks. I think so. Sophie immediately celebrated like someone had just announced free ice cream for life. Victoria laughed and hugged her. Yet even as I watched them together, I couldn't shake a feeling. Because whatever happened inside that conference room wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of the final decision, and judging by the look in Victoria's eyes as she stared out across the harbor toward the guest house that evening, she already knew exactly what that decision was going to be. Victoria already knew what her decision was going to be. The only question remaining was whether she was brave enough to make it. The days following the board meeting felt strangely peaceful. Too peaceful, like the calm before a storm. Willow Creek continued exactly as it always had. Fishing boats left the harbor before sunrise. The bakery sold out of cinnamon rolls by 9 o'clock. Mrs. Henderson continued interfering in everyone's lives under the disguise of community involvement. Yet beneath the routine, something had changed. Victoria seemed lighter. She smiled more easily. She slept better. She stopped carrying her phone everywhere. Twice I caught her leaving it inside the guest house while taking long walks along the waterfront. For most people, that wouldn't be remarkable. For Victoria Knight, it was practically a religious experience. Sophie noticed immediately. She stopped checking email every 4 seconds. 5 seconds, I corrected. Fair. My daughter nodded seriously. That's progress. The scary thing was that she wasn't wrong. Then Friday morning arrived. Victoria knocked on our front door just after 8. The moment I saw her face, I knew something was different. She looked nervous, not stressed, not overwhelmed, nervous. Everything okay? I asked. She laughed softly. Ask me in a few hours. That wasn't comforting. By noon, rumors were spreading through town. By 2 o'clock, everyone knew. By 3 o'clock, Willow Creek had collectively lost its mind. Victoria Knight had officially resigned as CEO of Knight Global. The announcement hit financial media like a bomb. News channels interrupted programming. Business websites exploded. Analysts panicked. Investors issued statements. Meanwhile, Willow Creek reacted by organizing an impromptu celebration near the harbor. Because apparently that's what small towns do when someone quits a billion-dollar job. When Victoria finally arrived at the waterfront, she looked stunned by the crowd waiting for her. Families, friends, neighbors, people holding homemade signs, children waving banners. The bakery owner had baked a cake. Nobody knew why. The cake simply appeared. Sophie sprinted through the crowd and launched herself directly at Victoria. You did it! Victoria laughed while catching her. Apparently. Are you scared? For a moment, Victoria thought about it, then she nodded. A little. Sophie smiled. Good. Victoria blinked. Good? That means it's important. The answer hit harder than anyone expected, including Victoria. The celebration lasted most of the afternoon. Music played. Food appeared from nowhere. At one point, Victoria stood near the harbor watching children run across the docks while sunlight reflected off the water. She looked peaceful, more peaceful than I'd ever seen her. Then she quietly moved beside me. You know what the weird part is? What? She smiled toward the ocean. I thought I'd feel like I was losing something. Another pause. Instead, it feels like I finally stopped carrying something. Neither of us spoke for a moment, because I understood exactly what she meant. For years she'd carried responsibility, pressure, expectations, and obligations so heavy she'd forgotten what life felt like without them. Now, for the first time, she was free. That evening, after most of the town had gone home, we sat together on the dock while Sophie chased seagulls for reasons known only to her. The sunset painted the harbor gold. Boats drifted gently across the water. Everything felt perfect. Then Victoria surprised me. I bought the guest house. My brain stopped functioning for several seconds. You what? She laughed. I bought it. You bought the guest house? Technically, I bought the property from you this morning. I stared at her. You can't casually mention that. Victoria looked entirely too pleased with herself. Apparently I can. For several seconds I couldn't think of a response. Meanwhile, Sophie overheard the conversation from halfway across the dock. Wait. She ran toward us at full speed. You live here now? Victoria laughed. Looks that way. Sophie screamed. Again. At this point, I was genuinely concerned about the long-term health of my ears. Then she wrapped both arms around Victoria. Best day ever. Victoria hugged her back without hesitation. And watching them together, something became painfully obvious. The guest house was never really about real estate. It was about permanence, about choosing to stay, about building a future instead of borrowing one. Later that night, after Sophie finally went home, Victoria and I remained on the dock, watching the stars appear above the harbor. The ocean stretched endlessly before us. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Then Victoria looked toward the little guest house glowing softly in the distance. Her home now. Truly hers. You know, she smiled. A few months ago I thought I was escaping my life. Another pause. Turns out I was finding it. I looked at her, really looked at her. The woman who had arrived exhausted and alone. The woman who now belonged to an entire town. The woman who had chosen happiness over power. And for the first time, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't afraid of Victoria leaving anymore, because she wasn't leaving. Now I was afraid of something else entirely. I was afraid of how much she had come to mean to me. I wasn't afraid of Victoria leaving anymore, because she wasn't leaving. Now I was afraid of how much she had come to mean to me. The realization followed me everywhere. Through long days at the marina, through community events, through ordinary dinners that somehow didn't feel ordinary anymore. The problem wasn't that Victoria had become part of our lives. The problem was that I couldn't remember what life looked like before she arrived. She was simply there now. Morning coffee on the porch. Harbor walks at sunset. Sophie running across the yard without knocking because apparently property lines no longer existed. The guest house lights glowing every evening. It all felt natural. Too natural. And that scared me. Because people don't fear losing things they don't love. Autumn arrived quietly in Willow Creek. The summer crowds disappeared. The harbor became calmer. The air turned cooler. Leaves painted the town in shades of gold and orange. Somehow life became even better. Victoria threw herself into community projects. She helped expand local education programs, funded scholarships, supported small businesses, not because she was trying to impress anyone, because she genuinely cared. The town loved her for it. Sophie worshipped her for it. Well, that was becoming a problem. One Saturday afternoon, the three of us attended a school fundraiser. Victoria spent half the day helping children with games, and the other half getting recruited into activities she never intended to join. At one point she was judging a pie contest. An hour later she was helping paint a mural. "How does this keep happening?" she asked. I laughed. "You're approachable now." Victoria looked horrified. "That's terrible news." Sophie shook her head. "It's wonderful news." The scary thing was that my daughter had become convinced she was some kind of relationship expert. Every day she dropped increasingly obvious hints. Every day Victoria and I pretended not to notice. Every day Sophie became more frustrated by our lack of progress. Then came the Harbor Harvest Festival, the biggest autumn event in Willow Creek. The entire town gathered near the waterfront. Music echoed across the harbor. Food stalls lined the boardwalk. Families crowded every corner. It should have been a normal festival. Instead, it became one of the most important nights of my life. Around sunset, Sophie vanished. Again. At this point, it should probably have been illegal. 10 minutes later, she reappeared carrying a camera. Smile. Before either of us could react, she snapped a photograph. Then another. Then 3 more. "What are you doing?" Victoria asked. "Creating evidence." Sophie nodded seriously. For later, neither of us wanted to know what that meant. The festival continued into the evening. String lights illuminated the harbor. Music drifted through the cool autumn air. At one point, Victoria and I found ourselves standing alone near the docks while Sophie was distracted elsewhere. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Victoria smiled softly. "You know," she looked out across the water. "This is my favorite place." I followed her gaze. The harbor, the boats, the lights reflecting across the ocean. Home. Minetu. Another silence settled between us. Comfortable, familiar, dangerous. Then Victoria turned toward me. "Thank you." The words caught me off guard. "For what?" She laughed quietly. "For not treating me like Victoria Knight." Another pause. Most people see the company first. Her smile softened. "You never did." The honesty in her voice hit me harder than expected. Before I could answer, fireworks exploded above the harbor. The crowd cheered. Children screamed with excitement. Colored light reflected across the ocean. And for a brief moment, Victoria's hand brushed mine. Neither of us pulled away immediately. Neither of us seemed particularly interested in pulling away. Then reality returned. The moment passed. Yet something had changed. We both knew it. We just weren't ready to say it. The following week, Sophie finally reached her limit. During dinner, she placed a photograph in the middle of the table. Victoria and I both froze. It was one of the pictures she'd taken at the festival. We were standing together on the dock beneath the string lights, smiling, looking happier than either of us realized. Okay. Sophie folded her arms. Explain. Victoria immediately started laughing. Explain what? This. My daughter pointed dramatically at the photograph. The obvious thing. I buried my face in my hands. Victoria wasn't helping. She was laughing too hard to function. Sophia Parker, I said, you are 9 years old, and somehow still the smartest person here. Unfortunately, several pieces of evidence supported her argument. The conversation eventually ended when Sophie declared both of us hopeless and left the room in disgust. Yet later that night, after she had gone to bed, I found myself staring at the same photograph. Victoria was doing the same thing, standing on her porch, looking toward our house, holding the picture. For a moment our eyes met across the yard. Neither of us looked away. Neither of us smiled. We simply stood there beneath the harbor lights, sharing a quiet understanding. Because for the first time, neither of us could pretend anymore. Whatever this was had stopped being friendship a long time ago. The only question left was who would be brave enough to say it first. The only question left was who would be brave enough to say it first. The answer, unsurprisingly, turned out to be neither Victoria nor me. It was Sophie. Again, winter arrived in Willow Creek with cold ocean winds, holiday lights, and an alarming increase in my daughter's involvement in other people's personal lives. By December, the entire town seemed aware of what was happening between Victoria and me. Everyone except the two people actually involved. According to Mrs. Henderson, we were moving at the speed of continental drift. According to the bakery owner, we'd probably need professional assistance. According to Sophie, we were both disasters. Life continued anyway. Victoria settled completely into Willow Creek. The guest house no longer looked temporary. Books filled the shelves. Flowers decorated the porch. The refrigerator contained actual groceries instead of takeout containers. More importantly, she was happy. Truly happy. The kind of happiness that changes a person's face. She laughed easily. Slept peacefully. Smiled without forcing it. The woman who had arrived exhausted from New York barely resembled the woman living here now. Then Christmas arrived. Willow Creek transformed into something out of a holiday movie. Lights hung from every building. Decorations covered the harbor. Families filled the streets. The annual Christmas festival brought the entire town together. Naturally, Sophie had a plan. That sentence should honestly be printed on warning labels. On Christmas Eve, the festival reached its peak. Music echoed through the harbor. Snow drifted gently across the waterfront. Children ran between decorated booths. Victoria stood beside me watching the lights reflect across the water. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled. This might be my favorite Christmas. I looked at her. Even compared to billionaire Christmases? Victoria laughed. Especially compared to billionaire Christmases. Another silence settled comfortably between us. Then Sophie appeared. Of course she did. She was carrying a small wrapped box. This is for both of you. Victoria looked suspicious immediately. Why do I feel nervous? Because you're smart. Sophie handed over the gift and stepped back. Slowly, Victoria opened the package. Inside was a framed photograph, the picture from the Harvest Festival, the one taken beneath the harbor lights, the one both of us had secretly kept copies of. At the bottom of the frame, Sophie had written a message. My favorite family. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Victoria stared at the photograph, then at Sophie, then at me. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. Soph, I know. My daughter smiled softly. You don't have to say it. The harbor seemed unusually quiet. The lights reflected across the water. Snow continued falling gently around us. Then Sophie did something remarkable. She stepped backward, then another step, then another, giving us space. For the first time in her life, she wasn't trying to push the story forward. She was simply letting it happen. Victoria looked down at the photograph again. Then she laughed through her tears. Your daughter is impossible. I've been saying that for years. Another laugh escaped her. Then she looked at me. Really looked at me. and suddenly all the excuses disappeared, all the hesitation, all the fear, every reason we'd spent months pretending not to notice what was happening. Victoria smiled softly. You know, her voice trembled slightly. When I rented that guest house, she laughed. I thought I was escaping my life. I stepped closer. I remember. She nodded. I thought I needed peace. Another pause. I thought I needed distance. Snowflakes landed in her hair. Harbor lights reflected in her eyes. Turns out I needed people. My heart forgot how to function. Completely. Then she smiled. Warm, honest, certain. I needed you. The world seemed to stop. The harbor disappeared. The crowd disappeared. Even the music faded away. There was only Victoria, standing in front of me, looking at me the way I'd secretly hoped she would for months. Then I finally did the thing I should have done a long time ago. I kissed her. The crowd erupted immediately. Apparently nobody had actually left. They'd simply been hiding nearby like emotional surveillance experts. Cheers echoed across the harbor. Applause followed. Someone started crying. It was probably Mrs. Henderson. Victoria laughed against my shoulder, while the entire town celebrated around us. Then Sophie appeared between us, with the expression of someone who had successfully completed a complex engineering project. Finally, I groaned. Victoria started laughing again. Sophie folded her arms proudly. You're welcome. The following spring, 6 months later, Willow Creek gathered at the harbor once more. This time for a different celebration. The entire town attended. Boats filled the marina. Families crowded the waterfront. String lights illuminated the evening sky. Standing beneath them, I looked at Victoria, the woman who had arrived as a stranger, the woman who had rented a guest house for 30 days, the woman who had accidentally become part of our lives. Then I dropped to one knee. The harbor gasped as one. Victoria covered her mouth. Tears immediately filled her eyes. Somewhere behind us, Sophie started celebrating before I'd even asked the question. Victoria Knight, I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. You gave my daughter someone to love. You gave this town someone to believe in. And you gave me a future I never thought I'd have again. Tears rolled down her cheeks now. So I smiled and asked the only question that mattered. Will you marry me? For one perfect second, the entire world stood still. Then Victoria laughed through her tears and nodded. Yes. Another laugh. Another tear. Obviously, yes. The harbor exploded. Cheers echoed across the water. Fireworks launched from boats. Music filled the night sky. Sophie nearly tackled both of us in celebration, and standing there beneath the lights, surrounded by family, friends, and an entire town that had quietly helped write our story, I finally understood something important. Victoria hadn't rented a guest house. She had found a home. Sophie hadn't gained a friend. She had gained a family. And I hadn't lost the life I once had. I had found a new one. Sometimes the best things don't arrive according to plan. Sometimes they arrive disguised as mistakes, detours, and unexpected guests. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, a woman rents a guest house for 30 days and stays forever. The end.